Listen to the first of these two pairs of words from two different foreign languages. Pie, pie. Dog, dog. Did you hear any difference between the P sound of pie and the P sound of pie? Did you hear any difference between the D sound of dog and the D sound of doc? You probably didn't, because these kinds of P's and D's are not heard as significant differences in the sound system of English. In other words, our ears are not trained to hear anything really different in these sounds. But if you were a speaker of Siamese or Hindi, you would have heard a great deal of difference in these sounds. In just a moment, we're going to show you why most of us have what might be called blind spots when it comes to hearing and learning the different sounds in a foreign language. In our program last week, we were talking about language learning. We were talking about the fact that a great deal of the structure, the system of a language was learned very, very early in a person's life and completely outside of his awareness. And that these particular parts of the structure were often not represented in the writing system, like the stress patterns that we were demonstrating. We were also talking, of course, about the different standards, the different levels, if you will say, between the spoken language and the written language, and how that these oftentimes got confused. Now, what we're going to do today is to talk about the patterning of the sounds themselves, the speech sounds that make up all languages. We're going down to the very smallest unit and see again how this amazing business of patterning takes place. Now, this particular business of the patterning of sounds, as we've already seen at the very beginning of our program, the differences and the similarities of sounds is extremely important if we're really going to be able to learn a foreign language correctly. Now, in the first place, what about this business of speech sounds? Well, one of the things that we find out is this, that the organs of speech, as we generally call them, can make an infinite number of speech sounds. But actually, we shouldn't really call these things the organs of speech. We should call them, well, I don't know, we can call them the organs of speech if we want, because we're interested in them as just that. But they're really in our bodies for quite different purposes, for the purposes of eating and breathing. And man, in inventing these amazing symbolic systems, which we call languages, has what we, as we say, overlaid the function of speech upon these particular parts of our body, which we will now, of course, continue to refer to as the organs of speech. So the organs of speech in the human being can actually make an infinite number of speech sounds. But the brain, which is part of this package, like a magnificent digital computer, is able to say, no, this is the same, this is different, this is the same. In other words, segment these particular things and pick them out and classify them, so to speak. So, we can say then that the human being can make an infinite number of speech sounds. But even over and above that again, you never make the same speech sound exactly the same way twice in your lifetime. Never exactly the same way twice in your lifetime. And yet again, this digital computer says this is the same and this is different, this is the same and this is different. It's this business of segmentation which makes language possible. And again, the human brain is absolutely essential to be able for us to talk languages. Now, the child, before he learns his language, sort of limbers up these organs of speech and makes a tremendous number of different kinds of sounds. Strange sounds to us. I can remember my oldest boy, when he was still in the crib, used to have, oh, wonderful time making the back K sound, as we call it, this kind of sound. Caw, 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 way back in the back of the throat. At 10 and a half, he can't make that sound at all, or has great difficulty doing it. And I tell him he used to be able to do it all the time when he was a very, very small child. It's hard for him to believe me. Why can't he make it now? Because that kind of sound is not a significant speech sound in the pattern of English, although it is extremely important in the Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew. Now, these speech sounds can be classified, and they are by linguists, of course, in two different ways, theoretically. Either by the acoustic properties, that is how they sound to us, whether vibrant or guttural or heavy or light, or what happens in the body when we make the sounds that we hear. That is a rough physiological classification. Now, although we are working, several linguists are working on a better acoustic classification of speech sounds, it is not yet as satisfactory as the old rough physiological classification, and I'd like to show you how that works right now. Here is a cutaway of the human head. Here are the two lips. Very important in the making of speech sounds. Here are the teeth. Here behind the teeth is a little ridge of bone that is called the alveolar ridge. Don't worry about these technical terms. They just will help me get through this kind of classification. I want to show you, we're just making a rough physiological classification. Now, if you put your tongue on this alveolar ridge and slide it back toward the roof of your mouth, you will go over that hard palate. Now, if you go even farther, where it gets squishy, back there, that soft part is called the soft palate or the velum. So you have the hard palate and then the soft palate of the velum, and the velum is a very interesting piece of articulatory mechanism in that it can close off the nasal passages to allow the air to come out only out of the mouth, or it can allow the air to come out of the nose, as in and so on, or ah. In other words, oral versus nasal. Now, at the end of the velum is a little tongue of skin called the uvula. And the uvula is a very interesting little piece of mechanism, and I want to show it to you now. I'm going to open my mouth and say, ah, the way the doctor says we should do it when he wants to see down our throat. And I want you to see that little tongue of skin that hangs from the end of the velum. Ah, 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 ah. See that little tongue of skin? Well, that's the uvula. Now, this particular uvula, it's very interesting. It makes some sounds, very important sounds. It's the kind of sound that, it's the kind of thing that happens when the Frenchman says Paris, for instance. But, you know, some years ago, when doctors used to take out tonsils, they used to snip that little uvula off. I mean, who needed it? Who wanted it? Well, of course, when the children that had their tonsils taken out at that time wanted to grow up and speak a language like French or German that have uvula sound, they found that they had the devil's own time trying to do it. Now, this whole business of the uvula and the velum again can, of course, cut off the whole nasal passage. Air can come out of the nose or can come out of the mouth in terms of whether or not that thing is closed or open. And down here, number 9, this is probably one of the most important parts of this machinery. This thing is the larynx, number 9, and actually out there is the Adam's apple. And here inside the larynx are what we have been taught to call the vocal cords. Actually, they should be called, I suppose, the vocal bands or the vocal lips. They're sort of cartilaginous bands. And they come together and are able to vibrate. And that vibration, as the air comes up through them, causes what we call voice, the technical term for it being voice. Now, to hear what voice sounds like, put your hands over your ears and say buzz, buzz. Now, again, say bus, bus. And in bus, you will notice there is no buzzing on that S sound in bus. Buzz, bus. That's a voiced sound versus a voiceless sound. Down here is the windpipe, of course, and here comes this way from the lungs the air, which allows us to talk, which goes through this larynx here. And this is the food pipe, or the esophagus here. And, of course, if you don't close off the epiglottis, sometimes you get the food, as we say, goes down the wrong way, and that causes a paroxysm of coughing. And we know how that is. People slap you on the back and so on. All right, now this business, then, of the classification of speech sounds actually is in that part of linguistics which we call technically phonetics. And in phonetics, what we are doing is studying the classification of the speech sounds, which are technically called phones. Now, the phones of a language, the sounds of a language, can be classified in two major ways, in terms of their manner of articulation and the place of articulation. First, I'm going to show you what I mean by manner of articulation. Again, there are a lot of technical terms here, but you're not supposed to have to memorize them now. This, again, helps me get these kinds of classifications across to you. The first kinds of sounds are called stops, and they're just what they mean. It means the air is stopped and then released. For instance, as in pin, or tin, or tin. You see where I stop the air momentarily and then release it. Affricates are like the stops, except there's a certain amount of air that goes along with them, like ch and j in church and judge. The spirants are those sounds that have lots of air on them, as in the F sounds and the S sounds. F, s, like that. They can be voiced and voiceless, of course, z and s. Now, the spirants, then the nasals, those that come out through the nose, the nasal sounds, and so on, and flaps, or taps. A flap, for instance, the sound the Englishman makes when he says vede, or mere, mare, mere, is an alveolar flap, that is, the tip of the tongue comes down against that little ridge behind the teeth. You have more than one flap. That gives a trill. For instance, when the Scotchman says very, three, that's a trill. Or when the telephone operator says three, that's an alveolar trill. In German, for instance, you can trill the velum. Oftentimes, speakers of German, when they say the word for red, rot, I'm not very good at that, but that is a velar trill. Now over here we have the place of articulation. That is, whether the two lips are used. That term bilabial simply means two lips used, as in pin and bin and my, the P, B, and M sounds. Labiodental, lower lip and teeth, as in and v, f, and v. Alveolar, whether the tongue comes against the alveolar ridge, as in tin and din. Palatal, whether it's on the hard palate, s and z, or that particular sound we heard in the da at the beginning of the show, way back on the palate. Velar sounds like k and g, r, k, and g, with a velum. Now to refresh your memory again from the chart we had a moment ago, here we are again. Place of articulation. Two lips bilabial. Tip of the tongue on that alveolar ridge, alveolar. If it were on the teeth themselves, dental. Palatal. On the hard palate, back of the tongue against the soft palate, the velum, velar. And then you see now we can actually use the classification both ways. For instance, let's take the last sound in the English word sing. It is actually a velar, that is, the back of the tongue goes against this velum, sing, and the air comes out of the nose. So it is a velar nasal. So that we can classify these phones in terms of manner of articulation and place of articulation, referring again to this rough physiology. And it works extremely efficiently. It's really, it seems, all we need to be able to classify the phones. But there's one thing about the phones. The phones really are not the smallest unit of speech. The phones themselves are bundles of smaller units, which we call the articulations. Now, the articulations are the things like stopness, or the things like spirantness, or the things like bilabialness, and these get bundled together to make a phone or a speech sound. For instance, have you ever noticed the real difference between the sound, the first sound in rye and the R sound, the second sound in try? Well, there's a lot of difference there if you listen. Listen again. Rye and try. This sound, the sound in rye, is a fully voiced sort of spirant. But the sound in try is a voiceless spirant with a tremendous amount of friction noise on it. Listen again. Try, as against rye. Now, how is it possible that although these particular phones are so different, that we react to them as though they were the same? Even though we can hear the difference when I bring them into your awareness, we write them with the same letter and we react to them as though they were the same sound. Well, the reason for this is this, that actually in terms of how languages work, what we are really listening for is a family of sounds. In other words, the R here and the R here, though different, belong to the same sound family, the technical term for which is phoneme. The phoneme is the family or the class of related sounds. Now, to show you how the phoneme works, I'd like you to step over here and look at this chart. Now, please don't get too concerned about this chart either. It looks rather formidable, but it's really not so formidable when I'm going to show you exactly what we're going to learn from this chart. First, I'm going to take the initial P sound as we hear it. That is the first sound in the word pin. And I'm going to show you the articulation units. It's a voiceless bilabial stop, the sound in pin, according to what we've just learned. In addition, it's fortis. That is, there's a strong amount of muscle contact when we say the sound in pin. But more important, it is aspirated, by which I mean there is a lot of air that comes out along with it, a puff of breath that comes along with it. Watch, it blows out a match. Pin, you see? I'll do it again. And you can do this, you can test it in the back of your hand. Pin, you'll feel that puff of air. Pin. Now, please notice that the P phone, or the member of this P family we're talking about, that is final. That is the one that is at the end, as in a word like up, is voiceless, fortis, bilabial, and a stop, but unaspirated. Watch. Up, 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 up. Doesn't blow out the match. Pin always does. Now, not only do we have an unaspirated phone final, but over here is the kind of P phone or sound we get after S. This one is voiceless, bilabial, and a stop, like all of the others. It has that kind of family resemblance, what we call phonetic similarity. But it is not only unaspirated, as the one in up was. Watch. Spin, spin, That particular blowing out of that was because of the S. Sometimes the S has a little air on it. Let me try it again. Spin, spin, but pin immediately blows it out. But not only that, there is a lenis, or light articulation, when we say the P in spin. Notice again, pin, lots of strength, but spin, spin, see how much lighter your lips come together on that. Now, the thing to remember here is this, that although there are differences in these phones, the speaker of English reacts to all of these sounds, as he did the R sounds in ri and tri, as the same sound, members of the same phoneme. These predictable, non-significant positional variations, which can be predicted every time, these things are called allophones of the phoneme. Another technical term, allophone simply means family member that's tied by resemblance. And the speaker of English will react to these differences that we have noticed as being essentially significantly the same sound. All of these allophones of P, and the phoneme P, consequently, contrast with all of the allophones of B, as in bin. In other words, pin and bin, two very different words in this language, pin and bin. But, again, patterned within the family, but also patterned within the system. What do I mean by that? I mean that not only are our P sounds aspirated initially, but all our other voiceless stops are too. Now, watch. In tin, you see, the initial phone in the T series, or the T family, also is aspirated and blows out. Same way with the K. King, you see, that blows it out. But by the same token again, the phone of T and K after S are lenis and unaspirated and won't blow out the match. Skin, skin, sting, sting. But again, tin, you see? So we get then patterning. Patterning at all levels. Patterning throughout the sound system. Allophonic patterning, which is predictable, and patterning throughout the system of the consonants. Now, I'm going to show you a chart of the consonant phonemes of English. Please, again, don't be startled by these strange symbols that I have here. The reason I am giving you this chart is to show you again the patterning of the English consonant phonemes, but also to remind you that we have no letters in our alphabet to represent these particular significant sound contrasts. Remember, in our second program, we talked about the fact that all writing systems were incomplete and inconsistent. Well, here's the patterning. It goes like this. Here are the voiceless and the voiced stops. PTK, bilabial, alveolar, and velar. BDG are the voiced, bilabial, alveolar, and velar. Perfect patterning. Voiceless and voiced affricates, as in church and judge. Voiceless and voiced spirants, as in fun, vun, thin, then, za, as in sin and zounds. And this one with a wedge over it represents the sound in she, and this Z with a wedge over it, the sound in measure, or azure, or garage. Now notice we need these symbols because we don't have any letters in our alphabet to represent these sounds. This 0 with a line through it and this cross D represent the voiced and voiceless spirants, difference between thin and then. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. Now down here we have our nasals, the bilabial nasal as in me, the alveolar nasal as in knee, and this one, this long N with a curl, represents that sound I've already talked about, the last sound in sing, a velar nasal. L and R are very interesting in English and in many other languages, interesting sounds we call laterals, which are quite like spirants in some way and like other sounds in others. I will simply use a sort of blanket term for them, laterals. But now what I want to show you is, again, the necessity of actually using these kinds of symbolizations when we're trying to get the significant patterning out of this thing. Our writing system is not going to show it to us. For instance, let's take this word thin and this word then. Now please notice in the writing system we have only the letters TH to represent these contrasting phonemes, the voiceless spirant interdental and the voiced one, the and the. Now the poor foreigner who doesn't have any spirants at all in this, for instance, a speaker of German doesn't, a speaker of many languages doesn't have any voiced spirants, they find an awful lot of trouble with the TH sound. But if they don't know that there is a phonemic contrast between the voiced and the voiceless, they get even more confused. In other words, it's absolutely necessary to have a systematic understanding of the patterning of your phonemes when you're learning a foreign language. Let's take even a more extreme case. Let's take the Spanish, which does not have this eng phoneme. That is, this sound we heard in sing, this velar nasal. They have a word in Spanish, tambien, which means also. T-A-M-B-I-E-N is the way it's spelled. But the speakers of Spanish, very frequently, particularly around Puerto Rico, for instance, will say both tambien and tambien. In other words, you'll say, did you say tambien with an N or tambien with an eng, so to speak? And he'll say, sí, tambien. You said tambien? Sí, tambien. Tambien? Sí, tambien. In other words, he does not hear any significant contrast between n and ng. Think then of the problem the poor soul has when he has to come into English, which has a phonemic contrast between n and ng. In other words, sin and sing are quite different words in English, and yet he'll hear them the same. Run and rung, thin and thing, quite different words. But when he wants to say the sentence, I run down the hall to get the things, he comes out with, I run down the hall to get the things, or I run down the hall to get the things, or I run down... Well, you can see he has one chance in 25 of actually coming out with the sentence, I run down the hall to get the things. This business, then, of phonemic patterning. The fact that it is essential for us to realize that there are no phonemes exactly alike in any language. The Frenchman's P and our P are not the same sounds, even though we use the same letter of the alphabet to represent them. The Frenchman's P, for instance, initially, as I showed you in the last program, is not aspirated. In other words, when he says, la pipe de la bouche de papa, there is no air. We say la pipe de la bouche de papa, and he ducks, as we noticed. In other words, we have got to have not only the phonemes brought into our awareness, our own phonemes and the phonemes of the target language, but the allophones as well must also be brought into our awareness. To get back to those words that I had at the very beginning of the program, please notice that the P sound in pi, the first word in Siamese, as against pi, were phonemically distinct, if you will, because of the business of aspiration versus lack of aspiration. Those two first sounds were very distinctive for the speaker of Thai, pi versus pi. In the Hindustani examples, those Ds, the first sounds, were quite distinct between the dental D, as in dak, and the techumenal or post-palatal D, as in dak. In other words, we don't hear any significant difference there, but they are very significant in that target language if we were learning either Hindustani or this other language, Siamese. In other words, the practical application to language learning becomes, I think, extremely obvious and extremely important. Now, what we've been talking about up to now has been actually the consonant sounds. But you may remember way back on the second program, we talked about the vowel sounds. And at that time, I told you there were 9 simple or short vowels in English and 3 semivowels. And every one of the short or simple vowels could actually combine with every one of the semivowels to give us what amounts to 36 possible nuclei. Here is that chart again. Here are the short vowels. Pit, pet, pat, just, pot, put, gonna, and fox, if you say it that way. You see? Now, what I'm saying now is that what we have here actually is 9 vowel phonemes and 3 semivowel phonemes which can go together. Now, you may remember on that second program I also showed you that this particular thing was a glide higher in fronter, this higher in backer with more rounding, and this glide, the H represented a glide to the center. And I gave you words like this. E, and you saw my tongue go up. A, you saw my tongue go up. Woo, or ooh, where you saw more rounding. O, more rounding as my tongue is rising back there. And then ah, more to the center, starting lower and go to the center. Ah, and so on, glide to the center. Now what we have here then is actually a combination of simple vowel phoneme and semivowel phoneme. In other words, the English system is divided between simple vowels and complex nuclei composed of 2 of these things. Now, I have to be honest with you. There is a great controversy still raging in linguistic circles as to whether or not such so-called long vowels as E really are composed of 2 segments, a simple vowel and a semivowel. Now, if this is true, and if this analysis that I'm giving you is right, then the Y at the beginning of the word and the Y at the end of a word, as in ye, or yea, or the H, ha, at the end of a word, they ought to actually sound very much alike if we could ever get in the world somebody to really be able to say them backwards. Well, in order to test this out, what we have actually done is to make a tape. And that tape, you will hear a speaker who actually says the words first in normal order. Then mechanically, we have run it backwards on the tape and then spliced it. So that what we get is first, you will hear the speaker say the ordinary word ye, said in words of that kind, said that way. Then you will hear that same speaker actually with his voice running backwards. And what I want you to do is to ask yourself this question. Do these things sound alike both backwards and forwards? Because if they do, then this analysis and what you've seen inside the mouth in terms of the physiology, it must be something very much like that. It must be the same. All right, here now is that tape.
Ye, ye, yay, 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 woo, woo, wow, wow, whoa, whoa, ha, ha.
I think you'll have to admit they sound practically identically, whether forwards or backwards, which gives us a pretty good proof that our analysis of simple vowel phoneme and complex and semi-vowel phoneme is a very good analysis. At least until something to the contrary comes in, I'm going to buy it. Now, one thing I know that today we have gone very rapidly, and I've used a lot of technical terms. I've had to be technical on this program. Actually, what I want you to take away is this, that we are dealing with patterning at the very lowest, smallest level, if you will, the very lowest level of language. That this patterning, these articulation units go into phones, and these phones in turn go into larger family units, which we call the phoneme. And that actually it is the phoneme that we listen to as the significant sound. In other words, we listen to the P contrasting with the B contrasting with the L, not with the phonetic contrast of the initial P with the final P and so on. These all are the same. In other words, to learn a foreign language properly, we must start right at this level, and we must hear the phonemic as well as the phonetic differences. We must have them brought into our awareness in spite of the way writing systems ignore them. Now, in our program next week, we are going to be talking about variations in speech, dialect variations. Every one of us has noticed the fact that the Southerner doesn't talk like the fellow from Boston, and he doesn't talk like the fellow from the northern part of Minnesota. In other words, how can we correlate this business of speech variation? Who talks how, for what reasons, why, or what can they be correlated with? So we are going to be talking about dialect variations, particularly in terms of vowel sounds, the same kinds of vowel phonemes that we were talking about here. That's what we're going to be doing next week. Speech variations, the whole matter of dialect, mainly on vowels, but also we will have something on vocabulary variations. Be with us then, won't you?
This is National Educational Television.